my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing another recent reads, and I'm going to start off with Femi Kayode's Lightseekers, which is the cover I keep flip-flopping on. Some of it, sometimes I think it's great, other times it kind of misses me. I don't know. This is about a psychologist who's called in after the fact, about a year later, if I remember correctly, of an incident in Nigeria where mob justice was done. And his area of expertise is on crowd dynamics, the madness of crowds, that kind of stuff, except well beyond, obviously, those books. And he is kind of there to solve who actually did it, because innocent people were killed and there's like a scapegoat that was used, but things aren't adding up, and a sort of wealthy benefactor seems to be competing with him in a way, as he keeps meeting people that are kind of like on this chessboard aligned against him, though not like personally or even all that antagonistically. They're there to disprove him in some ways, because some people have their minds set on who actually was the killer, and they don't want, for mostly political reasons, to have upset in the area for re-election, but also like justice was supposedly done, and upsetting or overturning that would be bad for them, basically. It's very slow going. It's somewhat character driven because there's actually a fair amount of personal problems that this guy has to deal with. He's on the outs with his partner. Right before he leaves, he thinks that he sees her hugging somebody else, intuiting that they might be having like a relationship, and then he's immediately packed off to this new area. So there's like all this tension and stress and stuff that he's dealing with. It's sort of like a slow build powder keg type situation. I give it 4 stars. I thought it was quite enjoyable. It's a different kind of detective thing set in a area and locale that I had no idea about generally. And it mostly worked, though it is quite quiet, and the blurb make it seem like it would be bombastic and thrillery. It's not quite that. Stray Dogs, stories by Rawi, Hage. I did not love this, but that's sort of normal for me. I give this 3 stars. It's a collection of stories. All of them sort of work reasonably well. None of them really sang for me, and that's kind of how short story collections generally go. Although Lindy from Magpie Reads, I think, was the one that suggested I should start doing short story collections where I read like 1 or 2 a day and then put it aside and then pick it up again. I have never done that, but I might try to do that at some point, because few and far between do short story collections really connect with me. So then I DNF'd This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I did this on audio, and it had good narration, but like just the most blandest, whitest of characters, basically, where you're just nothing of interest was happening, and he kept fronting himself like he was a big deal. Lots of like class dynamics, as you might expect with Fitzgerald, but it's just like nothing interesting was happening. So at 30% I was just done with it. Next was a phenomenal book, M. Son of the Century. I read this with Shelley Swearingen, and this was really interesting to me because I am really bad with historical texts in terms of remembering dates, remembering people, but that didn't really matter for this book. The overall themes and the movements, I guess you could say, of historical events were just fascinating. And those larger things, I think, got across to me, though I couldn't tell you the exact names of the people that were making the decisions. It also has a lot of rise and fall of the Third Reich vibes to me, in terms of just the sheer amount of data that is being collated into like a fiction, although this is fiction and the other work is nonfiction. The similarity is in how the kind of like ethos of the culture allowed these people to take power and subsume others and cow people who could have very easily, very, very, very easily disallowed them from gaining any kind of traction. At one point, like, the city is completely surrounded by troops that are very meager, like they are starving, they probably would not win whatsoever, and yet victory is sort of ceded to them just because conflict is wanting to be avoided. There's another instance at Parliament where had anybody, literally anybody, spoken up, Mussolini would have pretty much been toppled. Stuff like that. There's a lot of, like, you know, had people spoken out, good men done nothing, things would have changed quite a bit. And in particular, this voice I found very compelling, like probably the most compelling authorial voice that I've consumed. It's very like irreverent, cloying at the figures so that you know that it doesn't align itself with these people who are terrible, but then humanizing them to a certain degree and not vilifying them into a big bad that makes it sort of pointless to do so. And it was just a very compelling read. I did this on audio, and then I purchased this later. So I can wholly recommend the audiobook, though the narration is not like a 5-star narration, I think. It's more like a 4-star thing. Like, it mostly vibed with the book and was really well done. And I think it's a really, really hard text to nail and to exceed that sort of 3-star expectation that I have for voicing the book. It's still very good, but it's not perfect, I guess. Next, I read If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. I gave this 3 stars, and up until the end, I was really loving it. It is, again, pretty irreverent, is really clever at showing social and economic and political, basically all the nuances of being a minority in a new culture, and then like doing it in a pretty irreverent, sometimes quite funny way, but the subject matter is so dark that it's just sort of like constantly dancing across a line back and forth, and it somehow pulls it off. For most of it, it's about abuse and the circumstances in which the trauma cycle gets perpetuated. Some of it, I feel, the descriptions are quite good and the characterizations are good to excellent, but there are holes in it, I think, that are quite deliberate. And then also, it just doesn't manage to, because it's dancing across the line. I guess I preferred the much more serious tone most of the time because it is about such damaging things that I didn't find that the tonal shifts actually work to its advantage. And then at the very end, there's a meta context that just ruined everything for me, basically, in which it becomes a writer's group dissecting the story, and that feels like an obfuscation to address the actual holes in the story. Like, it feels intentional that she, or the writer, had put those things there and yet is sort of making fun of them. And it's, if you've seen some other videos of mine, I hate that technique. I hate that literary technique so much, where they just sort of like dance and laugh at their own mistakes or their own issues specific to the book, so much so that they like end up pointing you to things that you end up hating about the book that you didn't even notice at first. And it's just a complete 180 from the writers group, because a lot of the writers group is saying, stuff that Western culture people will misconstrue or let slide, or points various things out about the text that you probably wouldn't have gotten, but yet it also opens up holes about the text, and there was existing ones there that I had seen already as well. So I think it is not quite as smart as it thinks it is, and does not pull off that very well. But it went from a 5-star book to a 3-star book. So yeah. I then read Homeland by Cory Doctorow. I gave this 4 stars. This is the follow-up to Little Brother, and it's quite good. I gave it 4 stars. It's not a 5-star book. It is definitely formulaic towards the first one. Like, he gets in trouble with the law, and he develops counterculture movements and technologies and things in order to counteract that. It's again about the imperialism of the state, the tyrannical surveillance state that is being enacted, what you can do against it. It's YA. He has, again, relationship issues with the exact same person, and the tension between like another sort of antagonistic type person who actually becomes the main character of the next book that came out a year or 2 ago, Attack Surface. So that was interesting. It still exceeded my expectations, but the first book definitely is just sort of the masterclass in doing this. This is sort of like the updated pamphlet version 2 of the first one. So it's not gonna, it won't ever kind of like blow your mind or click with you in the same way that the first one did, basically. But it's really interesting to track all the differences of technology from the first book to this one, and what they're doing to compete against it, and different things like that. Next, I read with Shelley Swearingen The Magicians by Lev Grossman, a 5-star book, an all-time favorite for me. This book is Marmite or whatever, polarizing. I absolutely love it. It is about Quentin Coldwater, who's a big nerd, math genius, set up for Yale, classic white male protagonist thing on purpose. And when he is 17, before he graduates high school, he gets on his way to an interview with Yale or something like that, or Harvard. He gets co-opted by a magic school in which they invite him. He finds his way into the school to do a test that is shifting and shaping and magical. The test itself is like to see if you're kind of like an outcast, kind of think differently. And it is like something that weeds people out, yet he gets in. And so he goes from this sort of like depressed teen who's kind of infatuated / in love with his best friend, who in turn is a couple with his other best friend. So he's kind of like the lonely outcast guy, to being in a magic school named Breakbills and having a couple friends and learning magic with that friend group on the outs. And so the first half of this book is a really great criticism or irreverent focus on a campus novel and on magic schools. And the second half is a dissection and irreverent take on what's it called? Teleportation, fiction, transport, fantasy, teleportation, fantasy. Well, you know what I'm talking about. I just can't think of it. Portal fantasy, maybe? Is that the word? And so it works to subvert your expectations on both fronts. It straddles literary and commercial grade stuff in terms of prose work and characterization. It's the most literary of the series, in my opinion, and has, for me, it just knocks everything completely out of the park. It criticizes and, again, is very irreverent of the tropes that you would think of Quentin being the white male protagonist and being the chosen one and all of that kind of stuff. Time is very fluid and moves forward. He really just does his own thing, and you're going to be down for it or not. I think it is, again, just a brilliant take on fantasy, very subversive of genre. This is not Shelley's favorite one from the trilogy, and so I think she had mentioned something that was interesting, that if you aren't already very immersed and steeped in fantasy, that you won't get the satisfaction of the subversions going on in this book, which is probably true. But I cut my teeth, so to speak, on fantasy growing up, and so for me it's just excellent, though I adore the entire trilogy. And lastly, let's end with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I gave this 4 stars. This was better than I expected. The prose work is great. Frankenstein himself is just somebody that you want to wring the neck of, and that's on purpose, but is it kind of a struggle to deal with all of his crazy, like, his inability to see his own personal stakes and his own responsibility and his own kind of confluence of events that occur is just astounding. I think it's a very good way of showing like privilege in action, basically. And it was not a story that I was familiar with, having only seen like the TV adaptations and stuff like that. I was surprised mostly at every turn. But it is very Victorian. It's very melodramatic, and it feels very circuitous in its manner. Like he just sort of globe hops around and trots about and continually tries to obfuscate things. But that makes it sort of feel like the seams are showing, so it wasn't a perfect book for me by far. The ending was very satisfying, but yeah, it was just too Victorian, over-the-top drama and random stuff happening without connective tissue for me as well. So yeah, it was a 3.5 rounded up to 4, basically. Better than Wuthering Heights, though. And that is my reading update. I hope that you're doing well, taking care of yourself in this probably most stressful month of the year, I think, or at least for me it is. And I will see you next video.